This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, two-part series on manufacturing electrification, my guest is Cihang Yuan, Deputy Director for Climate and Renewable Energy at the World Wildlife Fund. She's going to describe key takeaways from the just-released report she co-authored for the Renewable Thermal Collaborative and the Industrial Heat Pump Alliance, called Powering American Industry, the Economic Opportunity of Industrial Electrification. Cihang's career began with research internships at the Nature Conservancy, Resources for the Future, and other forward-thinking organizations assessing carbon pricing strategies and policies. She then was a research assistant on data tool development with the World Resources Institute and served as a consultant to the World Bank. She's been a World Wildlife Fund official focused on climate and energy since 2018, Cihang, describe the Renewable Thermal Collaborative and the renewable thermal technologies the paper is focused on and their potential to support industrial electrification. And for that matter, what is industrial electrification and why is it important?
Thank you, Herman. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on this podcast. I want to start with just a quick introduction about the organizations behind this report.
Good.
The Renewable Thermal Collaborative focuses on decarbonizing industrial thermal energy use with renewable solutions. We work with a community of more than 120 major industrial heat users and clean heat solution providers to address the technology, policy, market, and financing barriers that make industrial heat so difficult to decarbonize. Our members include companies across sectors like food and beverage, pulp and paper, consumer products, pharmaceuticals, building materials, and other manufacturing industries. These are companies that make the products and materials that we use every day, from our toothpaste to our cars to our roofs. On the solution side, we work with a broad range of clean heat solution providers. This includes companies in industrial electrification, renewable fuels, solar thermal, geothermal. We also have providers that work on financing, consulting, and utility solutions. And since 2023, we also partner with the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy and the National Electronics Manufacturing Association, National Electric Manufacturer Association through the Industrial Heat Pump Alliance. The alliance focuses specifically on transforming the U.S. market for industrial heat pumps. And for this report, we looked at the economic opportunity associated with scaling industrial electrification in the United States over the next decade. It focuses on three core technologies: industrial heat pumps, electric boilers, and thermal energy storage. They're often called thermal batteries. The reason why we focus on those three technologies is that the starting point for RTC as well as IHP Alliance is industrial heat. That's the heat that manufacturers need to make food and beverage, dry paper, run chemical processes, clean equipment, etc. And a significant share of that opportunity is in the low and medium temperature processes, where many of them can be served by commercially available technologies that I just list out. Let's start with industrial heat pump. So they work by capturing heat from one place and upgrading it to the useful temperature. And because of how it works, they can generally be very efficient. Electric boiler is very straightforward. They use electricity to produce steam and hot water. In some facilities, they can replace or supplement existing combustion boilers. Thermal battery is very interesting. They convert electricity into stored heat through thermal mediums like bricks, molten salts, or other thermal media. And this is interesting because it gives manufacturers more flexibility. They may be able to charge a thermal battery when the electricity is less expensive or when there's abundance of renewable energy. So that gives the grid more capacity and use the store heat for later production.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, Sahan. I want to clarify. There's there's a lot of terminology that is very familiar with industry, and there's a lot of processes that you've described that is very familiar with people who are interested in industry, but maybe not for other kinds of listeners. So just to be clear, thermal means heat. And
Yes.
the idea is that industries, food processing, chemicals, whatever, they need to boil things, they need to heat things up to break them down into different components. And you want to be able to use clean energy sources to create that heat. So you have electricity coming from clean energy sources that then creates heat. But that heat may or may not be last long enough or reach high enough temperatures to do what the industries need. Am I saying all those things correctly?
Um, I think almost. So a few things. You're 100% right that the type of processes that we're talking about are things that you need heat to process certain products. Just very concrete examples could include pasteurizing milk,
Right.
brewing beer, or melting metals. And the reason why temperature matters is because most of those processes today, they use a natural gas boiler that burns around 2000 degrees Celsius. But not all of those processes actually need that level of temperature. Just thinking a concrete term would be boiling water to make tea. You don't need it to burn at 2000 degrees Celsius to make tea. So what we're trying to do is to figure out there are different alternative technologies that delivers different levels of heat, and how can we match it more accurately so there's higher energy efficiency. And this is why that low and medium temperature point matter, because those are temperatures and processes where there's readily available solutions like electrification that can easily replace the natural gas boiler that they're currently using.
Usually get up to those temperatures that are needed for those kinds of processes, right?
Yeah.
And then the thermal battery, that's a concept that not everybody really understands. It's actually finding substances, maybe molten salts or certain kinds of bricks
Mm-hmm.
that actually hold heat. So you can use your clean energy sources to create heat and that heat up, like I said, bricks or molten salts, and those things will hold that heat for a long period of time or a long enough period of time so that um, if you're using, let's say, a renewable source that may fade off at a certain point in the process, you can immediately bring in that stored heat from those other sources to keep your industrial process going. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. And I would also add that for a lot of those thermal battery technologies, they can provide continuous heat supply. So it's not necessarily that they can add in and be a backup. They usually need to charge maybe a few hours every few days, but then they can provide that continuous heat for productions.
See, so that brings us right to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the economic benefits. So maybe you can use clean energy to either boil things or pasteurize things. Maybe you can use clean energy to store it in these thermal substances that act like batteries. But what are the economic costs and benefits of doing those kinds of things? Is it economically efficient? Is I guess what I'm trying to ask. And what kind of benefits are produced if it's economically efficient?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this report that we put together look at the economic opportunity from those solutions in two connected ways. First is deployment. So that includes installing those equipments at the industrial facilities. And the second piece related to that is manufacturing. So producing those equipments, components, and systems needed to support deployment at scale. I want to know that we didn't assume all of the equipments will be manufactured domestically. what we assumed is that the domestic manufacturing captures a growing share of the market over time as the deployment of those solutions scale. So the manufacturing impact in the report reflects both the deployment of those technologies as well as an expansion of domestic manufacturing capacity. And what we find, the headline is that this is a significant economic opportunity. If we electrify low and medium temperature industrial electrifications with the solutions that are technically viable today, our estimate is that that will bring about 245 billion in total investment across deployment and manufacturing. And that investment will unlock 471 billion in total economic output and 185 billion in GDP growth and 1.6 million jobs nationwide over the next decade. And to put it another way, each dollar of investment supports about 1.85 in total economic activity. So it's very impressive rate of return.
That's really good. So every dollar you invest in, let's say, improving your plant so that it can use thermal storage. This is just an example. You can earn an average of $1.85 on that. Is that did I say that correctly?
I want to put a more nuanced point on how we interpreted that number. So that's not a facility level projection. We're not saying that every dollar one company invests at their facility will generate 1.85 in their own rate of return. It's more if we look at the macro level, this is what the every dollar of investment will get $1.85 of economic activity for U.S. economy more broadly. But that links to your question about the project economics at a facility level, because I want to note that what we find in this report is not meant to be interpreted as a projection. We want to capture the full economic potential of those electrification technologies. When we develop the model, the assumption that we use is if we electrify everything that's technically viable to electrify in low and medium temperature process today, putting aside the policy and market conditions, this is the full scale of economic opportunity. But then the flip side, connected to your question around facility level economics, is we are seeing there is still some challenges around deploying that at the facility level. The electricity price sometimes doesn't make operating cost economic all the way. There's also upfront capital investment challenge. This is why we want to make the case that it's a great economic opportunity, but it will not materialize automatically. We need a lot of policy and market condition to align to really allow the U.S. to capture that full economic potential.
We're going to get to that in just a minute. But basically what you're saying is that there's a possibility of hundreds of billions of dollars in investment and for deploying and manufacturing various kinds of industrial products. As a result of that investment, significantly more billions of dollars can be created in total economic output, in creating GDP, gross domestic product growth for the nation as a whole, and millions of jobs. That's essentially at a macro level what you're saying, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the two points I want to emphasize in that is one, just on the job front, what I think is really exciting and interesting from this analysis is it's not just the initial build out. Yes, there are some work that's project based related to construction and installation of those technologies or building out new manufacturing facilities. But there's also longer term roles in manufacturing, operation, maintenance. So it's not just a temporary construction opportunity. It creates meaningful, sustained, clean new jobs. And the other thing that was really interesting coming out of this analysis is that we find about 28% of the total economic impact is actually supported by out-of-state activity. This means that those benefits doesn't just stop at the state borders or at the factory gate. As those workers earn and spend income in their community, and as the companies source their equipment and service from other states, the investment happened in one state can actually support economic activities in others.
Interesting. Well, that's particularly valuable to take note of at a time when there's some concern about loss of jobs to AI and things like that. Here's an opportunity to create all kinds of new jobs. Now, I want to move on to another question that I have, a very important question in my mind. How significant could the new electricity demand from industrial electrification be? And doesn't that mean that new electric infrastructure is going to present with costs? How can utilities and their regulators address these new costs? So that people are going to start saying, well, our industries want to electrify, so we have to build new infrastructure, so we have to, raise rates. But I think that there are in the report, and I'd like to get you to talk about them, approaches to things like rate design, to planning, to interconnection of these new industrial plants, and to management of the supply chains that are going to help build them and maintain them, that can make this transition to industrial electrification more cost effective. Tell us about the costs and the potential ways to manage the costs, Cihang.
Yeah, that's another great question. So I want to start with the projected new electricity demand, because that's also front and center in our mind when we started this report. Our modeling suggests that industrial electrification could add roughly 250 terawatt hours by 2035. And just to put that in scale, that's about 4 to 5% of current US electricity demand, or 20 to 25% of the current industrial electricity use. So that increase is indeed meaningful. We need to plan for it. But it's also a manageable scale of growth, especially when you consider the size of economic opportunity the report identifies. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in potential economic activity, with about 20 to 25% increase in industrial electricity use. But I also want to emphasize that industrial electrification is significant but plannable load. In many cases, it can be shaped through things like rate design, thermal energy storage, demand flexibility, and better interconnection planning. It's usually not a case where a factory would go from 0 to 100% electrified all at once. Those projects tend to be more modular. They will start with specific processes, a hot water system, a boiler replacement, etc. And then build from there as equipment's turnover, capital plans develop, and economics improve. So that makes industrial electrification a little bit different from some of the load growth conversation we're seeing around things like data centers. A large data center is often discussing hundreds of megawatts and is sometimes on a very aggressive timeline in a concentrated location. But industrial heat pumps or e-boilers are often deployed in the scale of single megawatt to tens of megawatt blocks. Thermal battery can scale from smaller systems that are single-digit megawatts to much larger installation. But they're modular and they're designed around when electricity is available and affordable. So where I want to emphasize is that utilities are not being asked to absorb all at once hyperscale load. What we want to talk about is better coordination. Those are at existing facilities. It's tied to a known process. So there's a lot that both sides, industrial customers and utility, can do to pace this right and shape this in the right way, which is also why in the report, then we talk about things like better time of use rates, more demand response program. All of that is to create better signals for industrial customers on where load flexibility matters, and if electricity is more expensive at a certain time, less expensive at a certain time, and then those technologies allow them to respond that way.
I think it's worth noticing that the things that existed for manufacturing to make manufacturing more amenable to communities, economic development, jobs, flexibility, those things will still exist for these processes. They may not, they may or may not be available to people who are building these giant data centers on these extreme timelines. But what you're saying is that what we've done to manage manufacturing and to harvest the benefits of manufacturing in the past will be more as effective or more effective with the manufacturing electrification. I think that's a right way to say it. Am I right?
Yeah, and I would add that in some of the conversation that we've had with the utilities, they generally already think industrial customers are very good customers to work with, not just because of their scale, but also they usually operate at very high vectors. So they usually operate 24/7 or close to that. So that consistent and steady load already makes them easy to work with. And then to add on that, with those new industrial electrification technology, they can make those load more flexible, more responsive to system stress. So that's why we think this is a really good opportunity, not just for industrial customers, but also for the utility, for what the grid is seeing, like increasing stress, the cost challenges. Industrial electrification can actually be part of the solution to those.
Exactly. Okay, we don't have a whole lot of time left, San, but I want to talk about one more set of concerns or for this transition that you're describing. I think that we haven't mentioned the national security benefits to industrial electrification because we're going to be using domestic sources of fuel, and we're going to be able to build more domestic industry by making this transition. I want you to talk just a little bit about that, but mainly what I want to ask you about is the policy and regulatory support, because I think there may be some important policies and regulations that can accelerate this transition. Talk a little bit about that before we get done here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of national security benefit, industrial electrification can strengthen U.S. energy security and industrial competitiveness at the same time. So, from the manufacturer standpoint, one of the benefit is reducing exposure to fuel price volatility. If they're using traditional fuel-based heating systems, for instance, natural gas, they're exposed not only to normal commodity cycles, but also disruptions from extreme weather, infrastructure constraints, and geopolitical shock. Just as an example, the war in Ukraine entirely reshaped the global gas market and increased the European LNG demand and contributed to significant domestic natural gas price volatility in the US in 2022. And it showed that as the US exports on LNG grows, domestic gas market becomes more connected to the global demand and less insulated from the global gas price shocks. And severe weather events can also lead to significant swings in regional gas price. We're not saying that electrification make the energy cost automatically cheaper or risk-free because gas price also affects electricity price. But what makes electrification a really useful tool is that it gives manufacturers more ways to manage that cost over time. You can do long-term power purchase agreements, and if you combine that with things like on-site generation, thermal energy storage, flexible operation, there's more ways for companies to manage that use of energy and cost of energy. And for companies that are competing on really tight margins, that kind of cost management option matters. And then the second piece that's really important is this domestic manufacturing capacity. There's a lot of, and I think this is where the economic and the security opportunity reinforces each other. If the US manufacturers want to electrify and have to heavily rely on overseas supply chains for equipment or maintenance expertise, projects will become slower, more expensive, and harder to replicate. And as those technologies become more important for industrial competitiveness, dependence on imported equipment creates strategic vulnerability. So building that domestic production capacity and skilled workforce is not just about capturing those manufacturing jobs. It's part of what determines how quickly and cost effectively we can deploy those technologies and how much of that economic opportunity US will be able to capture.
What policies can drive this? We're running short of time, so I'm pushing you a little bit, Sean. I apologize. But
Yes.
briefly, policies that can support this, things like permitting reform and bringing new technologies to the power system would certainly help with this, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things that we've thought about. One, as we already discussed, electricity pricing is really a big part of it. So rate design that can make electrification more economically viable, things like time varying rates, load growth tariff, demand response programs, those can be incredibly helpful in making the operating costs better for industrial electrification projects. And then the other thing is how do we help support manufacturers on those upfront costs? Because this is not just a simple equipment swap. Sometimes they require engineering study, process integration, system retrofits. So grants, tax credits, any like technical assistance can be really helpful on that front. And then the other thing that we talked about is the domestic production capacity and workforce. So this is where things like production incentives, demonstration and commercialization support, better permitting for those manufacturing expansion can be very helpful. And then workforce development, partnerships with community college, apprenticeships, labor organizations, and even practical support like transportation, childcare, and flexible training options. Those really tangibly help workers make it easier for them to move into those roles.
And I just want to mention that um, a lot of those policies that you mentioned, especially loans, low interest loans, grants, that sort of thing, came out of the Biden administration, driven by one of our great secretaries of energy, Jennifer Granholm. And the fruits of what that Department of Energy did to drive industrial electrification is still blooming. But that's all the time we have, Cihang. I'm going to thank you. It's been wonderful talking to you. My guest has been World Wildlife Fund Deputy Director of Climate and Renewable Energy, Cihang Yuan, for describing key takeaways from the just released report she co-authored for the Renewable Thermal Collaborative and the Industrial Heat Pump Alliance called Powering American Industry, the Economic Opportunity of Industrial Electrification. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown, and as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.